How is it being Republican in California right now?
You could probably get all the Republicans in San Mateo and put them into phone booths.
You're a unicorn. You're a Republican that did criminal defense in
I
California.
know. Sort of embarrassing, isn't it?
Well, I think these biases that we have about the behaviors of Republicans versus Democrats is all wrong.
Part of the problem in politics is that we have this pendulum that swings back and forth. We never quite get to stop the pendulum right in the middle when we get to what I would call perfection.
It must be an interesting time because people are just so damn sick of how California is operating. I'm Nicole Shanahan. Welcome to Back to the People podcast, which highlights the growth of a movement uniting America, where our government is free from corporate capture and where we give voice back to the American public. Judge Stephen Bailey, thank you so much for sitting down with me here today. You've been here in California for a long time and really on the front lines of criminal justice and criminal justice reform, as well as really helping us defend constitutional freedoms in the state. All good things. You are part of and spearhead the California Constitutional Rights Foundation.
That's correct.
You're involved in election integrity.
That's also correct.
And but I think the topic that I'd love to connect with you on today is criminal justice and criminal justice reform. And this is the first time I've sat down with an expert like yourself on the podcast to talk about this publicly. It's a big issue. It's not just about the criminal justice system anymore. It's very political. And we know that what happens here in California gets shipped out to other cities across the United States. So it's really important we get it right here.
That's correct. You know, part of the problem in politics is that we have this pendulum. It swings back and forth. We never quite get to stop the pendulum right in the middle when we get to what I would call perfection in the law. And over the last 50 years, we've seen the pendulum go from soft on crime to really too hard on the process, not recognizing that contributing factors are many times drug abuse and mental illness. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, what we've seen recently is the pendulum swing to the point where we're essentially lawless in the state with no tools left for the courts and the criminal justice system to really address the serious problems that we have in our society with people who need mental health services and people who need drug abuse services.
It's really interesting to hear your take on it, which sounds very balanced. I got involved in criminal justice reform in 2016, and I was drawn in by this real desire to work on our over-incarceration and the inefficiencies in the system.
Right.
And you just said something right now that really resonated with me, that there's this swing and you can never get to that sweet spot of moving forward because it becomes so politicized that there's the cops versus the low-income communities, which is not necessarily how it is or it was, but the swinging has created tension, and that tension just grows and grows and grows. When I came in 2016, the first thing I saw was just areas for improvement and innovation in how we manage the docket system so that people can get, fast and fair treatment in the courts. And not have things stalled and held up, which is a common complaint from everybody.
Right.
And so I, as a young software developer in legal technology and a young lawyer, naively said, well, if I just focus on the infrastructure and even creating blind charging systems, right? Like where we had tested all of these things at Stanford, where we created, this veiling test where we would veil all kind of personal identifying information to reduce bias at the DA's office. And so naively, I thought that this was the path towards progress. And I still believe it's possible if we take politics out of it.
Yeah, I think fundamentally
Yeah.
having a fair justice system is having people who can fairly exercise discretion. Whether you're a judge, you have to exercise your discretion as a judge. If you're a prosecutor, you've got to be able to exercise common sense and discretion when you're deciding what to charge. And finally, if you're on the defense side, you've got to have some discretion. You've got to be able to say that, look, you committed the crime. There's a price that you have to pay for committing that crime. I, as a defense attorney, while I have a absolute duty to protect your rights, to ensure that you have a fair trial, I also have a duty to society as a whole to ensure that there is justice done. Just as the prosecutor has that responsibility to ensure that justice is done. When all three of those join together and use common sense and discretion, we get a just system. We don't over-incarcerate people. We recognize that they need some services. We also recognize that we've got to have the social service component, because once they get out of jail, you can't just turn them out on the street. You want to be able to make sure that they can then rejoin society and be productive in society. And what we've seen over probably 50, 60 years, and it sort of dates me now, but over 50 to 60 years is this pendulum go from what we would refer to as soft on crime. It will swing all the way over to the point where we're putting somebody in prison for 25 to life because they stole a sandwich out of a convenience store.
Or for smoking marijuana, which we know Kamala Harris put quite a few people in prison when she was at the helm here of the criminal justice system.
I mean, I don't necessarily support her for president, but I understand what was going on in those days, because I was defending people. Being a good Republican, I was never supposed to go into, defense work. I was supposed to work for a prosecutor, right? But I spent a good 20 years of my career defending people who got charged with everything from, drinking public intoxication to the death penalty.
You were a public defender?
I was a private attorney that I did indigent defense.
Oh, interesting.
A lot of indigent defense. And so I had all kinds of cases, and then spent 8.5 years as a judge. So I got a little bit of both sides.
You're a unicorn. You're a Republican that did criminal defense in
I
California.
Know. Sort of embarrassing, isn't it?
Well, I think these biases that we have about the behaviors of Republicans versus Democrats is all wrong. And I've really, in this election cycle, been tested time and time again about my own biases about people, especially the biases that I was raised around Republicans. And, my grandfather, Patrick Shanahan, retired to Tahoe, spent a lot of time in Tahoe, which was your county, El Dorado County.
Yes.
And he was a Republican.
Yes.
and just such a gentleman. Just loved my grandfather, but I was always confused by his Republicanism, because I was raised in Oakland and I was told Republicans put everyone in prison.
Yeah. Well, see, that's part of the problem in our society as a whole today. We have compartmentalized each of us. You're a Democrat. you can't associate with somebody that isn't a Democrat. You're a Republican, you can't associate with someone that's not a Republican.
Yeah.
That is something, I mean, that's harming our society as a whole, because collectively, we are just people. And when we see each other as a person and we don't see someone by gender or sex or, anything that can, put us into this box, if we just see ourselves as people, we can function very well as a society, and we collectively make good decisions, because the key is not having everyone who's agreeing with one another. It's having people who disagree so that we can then consider somebody else's idea and come to the solution that is best for all of us as a whole.
I will say the groups that I have been working with, these grassroots organizations in criminal justice reform, they've fallen further and further away from the constructive things that make communities safe. And the constructive things that make it's their own communities. I will tell you, the Asian American community right now in California is really frustrated because in many ways, the Asian American community has always kind of looked to Democrats as being the open, welcoming party. But now that the Democrats are not protecting small business owners,
Right.
for which Asian Americans in California are major small business owners and small business entrepreneurs in a lot of these communities in which the police no longer are able to protect them and their businesses
Right.
because of the way criminal justice reform has, and calling it soft on crime doesn't even seem like the correct definition at this point. It's almost a validation of a two-tiered system in which certain kinds of criminals are preemptively vindicated. And this preemptive vindication, or almost a, this inversion of like, we actually are supporting you in your endeavors because you deserve to go and steal up to $900.
Right.
I mean, that's the message, is that in this state, there is almost a incentive to go and rob a small family business on a corner over here in Oakland or in the East Bay. And it's hitting these communities that are the most vulnerable communities. You can't get away with that here in Woodside and Atherton and Palo Alto. You'll get arrested. You might not get charged, but you'll get picked up and you'll get put on a watch, like you'll get put on a list of, yes, this individual has robbed this place, keep an eye on him. But in communities like Alameda County, that doesn't exist. That kind of protection of individuals and small businesses doesn't exist. And I hear this outcry from the communities, help us. We are suffering so much right now. We're barely getting by. And now we have no rights for protection.
Right. And that's part of this swing of the pendulum. And what we, if you go back far enough, you'll see this go through this swinging in the 60s. We had almost lawlessness because of Vietnam as one of the factors. Almost lawlessness. We had.
Was it this bad in the 60s?
The 60s were pretty bad. The 70s, we then, with the election of George Deukmejian, began to swing back. And through the 80s and into the 90s, culminating with the 3 strikes, we were going to be tough on crime. And we were tough on crime. By the end of the 90s and into the 2000s, we were putting tens of thousands of people into our state prisons. Well, it reduced crime, for sure, But it also left a lot of people with the inability to reenter society. And so by 2014, we had people like Kamala Harris and Prop 47 coming in. Prop 47 was supposed to be the Safe Streets and Schools Act. We were going to save all kinds of money by reclassifying certain offenses to misdemeanors from felonies. One of the key things that we eliminated was petty theft with a prior. Prior to 2014, if you went out and committed a petty theft, and at that time it could be anything up to, $900, you could be charged on a subsequent petty theft with a felony, and that could subject you to 3 years in the state prison. So Prop 47 was a reaction to this really tough stance that the people of the state of California had taken earlier.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, we're going to reclassify all these. We kind of misled the public, the voting public, with this idea that we were going to get safer streets and safer schools because we were going to take all this savings and give it to the counties, and they were going to be able to provide all kinds of services to people. Well, that never materialized.
Why didn't that materialize? This is something that I'm seeing is a problem with Measure J in LA County too, which is something I supported, which is a care first approach to rehabilitation as an alternative to prison. And, I will say at first it looked really good to me, but executing on these visions appears to be very hard in California. Why is that?
Well, it was almost impossible because when you're pretending that you're going to reallocate money you're spending, in one box to another box, the politicians, let's say the Assembly and the Senate and our governor, and I'm not being harsh on them, but there's this real desire then to say, well, if I've got $1 billion that I can redirect to the counties, I've got a big hole to plug in getting streets and highways fixed. Well, I'll just redirect it to streets and highways. Or as happened in the early part of 2012, 13, 14, the state was in a huge budget deficit. So they just used that kind of money that they had, these savings that they were getting, they used to plug other problems that they were having out there. And so the money never actually got transferred in the appropriate amounts to the county. So the savings accrues to the state. The counties don't get it, so they can't do the programming. But on top of that, when we changed the definition of the punishment for various crimes, so we moved them from felonies to misdemeanors, suddenly you got a situation where prosecutors weren't going to spend a lot of time prosecuting, say, a petty theft, and we had changed the law so that not only could you do a petty theft in one business, but if you went down the street and made sure that you kept it under $960, you could commit another petty theft same day, right next to the business you had already stolen from.
Right.
That just sort of encouraged people to, as long as you kept it below the threshold amount, you just kept committing the crime. And so rather than having the ability of a prosecutor to say, hey, you went out and committed 3 thefts in a row, I'm going to prosecute that as a felony, suddenly you couldn't do that any longer. And so judges then started saying, well, heck, if it's only a misdemeanor, it's worth 90 days. Or maybe if you've got a long record, maybe it's worth 6 months. We forget that when they say that a person can be sentenced to 3 years in the state prison, that you get half-time credits. And in fact, under current law, you can get up to just do 1/3 time, and you're out of out of jail pretty quickly or out of prison pretty quickly, there's then an incentive because it's the price of doing business if you're in the business of committing crimes. So you go out and commit a crime, you get 6 months. Well, 6 months, I'll do it over the winter, get out in the summer and go out and commit more crimes. Having 20 years as a defense attorney, I saw people come, they'd roll through regularly. Every year I'd have another case from them. And it's because there's no accountability for the person because the cost isn't high enough to deter them from doing it.
Of course not. If it's not considered a serious crime, you can walk into that corner store as many times as you want and just keep cycling through. And it makes sense. I mean, why would you pay for your food and your razor and your alcohol when you can just go in and take it?
Right.
And the police aren't actively patrolling in low-income neighborhoods because they're just so overwhelmed. And in some cases, the police departments have transformed into these very kind of anemic, low-quality organizations that just feel so disempowered and can't attract good people because they don't feel supported.
That's true. The big issue, or one of the issues, I don't want to say it's the big issue, but when you remove the accountability, you absolutely get an increase in crime. You also get an increase in the seriousness of the crime because if petty theft is no longer a big deal, well, what about a burglary? Why don't I just break into your home and steal from you? So the thief now moves up.
Which is what's happening in LA County.
Which is what's happening all over California.
All over California, yep.
So a burglary may not be as bad as I break into the home and you're home, so I'll assault you while I'm stealing from you. So now I have a robbery. And pretty soon that doesn't always, but morphs into things like assault with a deadly weapon, murder. And what we've failed to recognize is that there's a progression in how crimes are committed, that it generally moves from low level to much higher level crimes. And if you don't then, during the process, one, prosecute them, and two, have judges that are going to make the person feel accountable, but also think at the same time, what are the individual's needs? If they're a drug addict, you've got to have the mechanism to get them into drug treatment. If they are mentally ill, you've got to have a mechanism to get them into mental health services. Because a good portion of our criminals that we would normally refer to as criminals also have all these other needs which people have tried to address over the years. But what we did with Prop 47 and some other laws that we passed during that particular time in the 14, 15, 16 period is that we suddenly took away from judges the mechanism to be able to make a person comply with the services that they needed. So if they were a drug addict, rather than saying, I'm going to use the criminal justice system, that I've got a person in front of me right now, rather than use that system, I'm just going to say, hey, wouldn't you like to get into some drug treatment? An addict doesn't want to get into any treatment. They like the drug. The drug makes them feel good.
Well, and they're chemically addicted.
Exactly. So if you don't have a mechanism to apply the screws to someone, to tell them you're going to go to this treatment program and you're going to complete it, or you're going to go to prison, if there's no mechanism there, the trade-off to them is, one, I don't have to do the drug treatment because the judge has nothing that he can do to me. And so we eliminated that piece of the criminal justice hammer. And so suddenly judges were now left with basically cajoling a person to get into a treatment program that they didn't want to be in. Whereas when I was on the beginning on the bench, what I was able to do as the head of the drug court in our county, I was able to compel somebody. One, I could offer them drug court. They could volunteer. They volunteered to get into it, except if they didn't volunteer, I was going to send them to prison. So it wasn't really that they were getting a choice. They went to the program or they went to state prison. When we eliminated that, it was go to the program, and if you don't, well, what do I do about it? So judges stopped worrying about it, or at least in my opinion, they became less aggressive in trying to get a person treatment because they had no mechanism to enforce it. And now we've gotten to the point where it's, wouldn't you like to go to drug treatment? It would be better for you. And the addicts are saying no. And the thieves are saying, you're not going to be able to do anything to me. I'll go to jail. I'll get booked out and released. I'll go to court maybe if I feel like it. When I get to court, I plead out. I get time served. And I've been on the street. I'm back on the street again to go out and commit new crimes.
Yeah.
The current proposition, Prop 36, that we have on the ballot will move that back a little bit. It'll give a little bit more balance to where we had left. It'll kind of help force people into treatment. Probably won't be the coercive impact that we had, say in 2010, but it's an attempt by the people, and this really is an attempt by the people, to get some balance back into our criminal justice system. I'm a strong supporter of Prop 36.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say this is from the people, because even bleeding heart liberals in LA County are voting for Prop 36. I have a friend of mine who is as liberal as they come, who submitted his ballot, and he said, LA County is a real disaster. So I kind of voted conservative locally and liberal nationally. And it's just like, my mind is kind of blown, because I'm like, don't you understand? California is where they test all of the stuff to go federal.
Right.
and if it happens here, you green light it in Washington. And so, no, we actually have to come to a point where it's not viewed as a conservative necessarily trend to want safety in your neighborhood.
That's right.
Especially if being conservative in a place like LA County is considered kind of, an unfavorable thing, right? In a very liberal area. But it's becoming more reasonable and rational. I think people are waking up because they've been hurt. And they've been
correct.
Personally affected.
That's absolutely correct. And I think, part of the beauty of the initiative system is that the people don't have to depend 100% on elected representatives in Sacramento. They can go out, join together. And I think you hit it right on the head. Prop 36 is where people across the political spectrum, from, the far right to, frankly, the far left, join together, not 100% of the people, but significant numbers of people on all sides of the political spectrum joined together and said, hey, we want something rational. We're looking for that perfect point at the center. And whether we get it with Prop 36, I don't know, but it's going to draw us back to a point where we're going to be closer to that perfect center.
Well, it treats a crime as a crime appropriately. And it treats repeating a crime by individuals who are ignoring the rights of shop owners and home, people in their homes and private property. And, people, it recognizes that these people have rights.
It does.
Which is really, really important. It's such an important balance to draw. So I was following the crime statistics very, very closely, starting in 2016 until now. And they started to look funny. They
Yeah.
didn't look right. It wasn't reconciling what I was hearing on the streets and what I was seeing in these NGO reports and even some of the city level municipal reports.
Right.
I'm like, something is not right here on the reporting. Because everyone I was talking to in the city of San Francisco said that starting in and around 2019, it started a little bit before that, but starting in and around 2019 and 2020, and certainly during COVID, it was unbearable in the city of San Francisco, the amount of crime and what did they call it? The fentanyl slump,
Right.
the just desecrating public places. It was unsafe to walk anywhere in 2020 and 2021 in San Francisco. And prior to that, it was actually okay. Like San Francisco was fairly safe.
Sure.
And so the crime statistics I was seeing in 2016, even under George Gascon, who I thought did a reasonable job in the city of San Francisco, people loved him so much, they voted in a real radical after him, Chesa Boudin. Who I was like, I am for criminal justice reform, but what Chesa Boudin represented was not that. Chesa Boudin was something else entirely. He was an individual who came in to play the role of DA, but had no interest in actually enforcing laws.
Right.
So, George Gascon, though, former police chief, former police officer, wanted reform. People were impressed with him in San Francisco. And the crime rates weren't too bad. It still felt safe. But then 2020 happened. We get both Chesa Boudin and COVID.
Right.
And things got really bad. But the crime rates that I was seeing, the statistics that were being reported, the crime rates being reported at the time, showed a decrease in crime. And it did not pair with what I was seeing with my own ears and eyes, experiencing when I went to San Francisco during that time. Storefronts were boarded up. People I knew had guns pulled on them in their neighborhoods. People were scared. There was a real tension and fear on the street.
Right. And part of
How does that happen?
Well, part of that was law enforcement, after the pendulum had swung back with Prop 47, suddenly law enforcement said, well, there's no real incentive for us to go out and enforce petty theft. There's no incentive for us to go out and arrest people for drug crimes because we had taken most of those crimes, reduced them to misdemeanors. Misdemeanor crimes, for the most part, are not really prosecuted by any district attorney. I mean, they prosecute the crimes, but the value of that crime is so minimal that the work involved is, just reaches the point.
Well, and the cost of incarceration is expensive as well.
Yeah, well, you're not going to put them in jail. Most misdemeanor events are going to be, unless you've got a real record, probably 90 days to 180 days. And police officers viewed that is not really worth the effort. And so they stopped really enforcing petty theft crimes, which directly resulted in increased theft. And pretty soon, the big things we started to see on TV were gangs going into department stores and everybody's, stealing everything they could steal. Well, that was a direct result of not enforcing theft crimes prior to that.
But Prop 47 passed in 2014 and then went into effect immediately.
As soon as it was certified, it became effective.
But it didn't seem to get really bad. Like, people weren't complaining. Like, this wasn't an epidemic, I feel like, in the cities until around 2019, 2020, when COVID happened.
Right. And that's a product of the community that is engaging in these types of crimes, learning that there are going to be no consequences. And law enforcement who were still doing their job in 2014, 2015, going out and investigating and prosecuting and sending the reports forward to the DAs who were looking at it and saying, well, there's really no incentive to really prosecute this guy. And so pretty soon you got two things. One, nobody was going out and investigating the crimes they knew were happening. So there were no statistics to give. Law enforcement or the district attorneys are looking at it and saying there's no incentive to really go out and throw the book at this person. So consequently, the prosecutions dropped. They didn't file as many. And then finally, the ones that they did file, they just let plead out for something that wasn't as draconian as we had prior to Prop 47. So your statistics, it's sort of like, garbage in because you're not reporting all the crimes that are being committed. So statistically, it looks like everything's getting better when your lying eyes say things are getting worse.
Right.
And Prop 36 becomes the direct result of that fiction that we created, that there's really no crime. And that's why the politicians began to say, oh, everything is getting so much better. When you as a voter, when you went to San Francisco or went to Alameda or, downtown Oakland, you wouldn't voluntarily put yourself into that position any longer.
Oh, I have a friend that I grew up with was stopped at a stoplight in Oakland. He's a filmmaker.
Okay.
He has done a lot of that beautiful filmmaking for the Warriors. And had his car broken into as he was sitting in it and his camera equipment taken.
Yeah.
I mean, these stories are outrageous. And this is where I've been really frustrated with a lot of these people funding criminal justice reform that I've worked with over the years, is they've made it about race. They say it's about locking up Black and brown people, and the people who want to do that are the wealthy white people. And I'm just like, this is not the right narrative, because I'm from Oakland. And, the people who are complaining about crime are of every skin color. Right. And they're frustrated and scared. And they want to know that when they call the cops because there's a robbery, the cops are going to come and investigate it or try to investigate it. But they're not. They can't. They don't have the bandwidth to.
Yeah. And there's nothing that's going to get done
and there's
in
nothing.
the end.
And they have no rights. So the communities that are the most impacted are communities of a diversity of races, and they have no rights as victims.
Again, you got to have a consequence to the crime. Just having a crime on the book is not the same as holding a person accountable for the crime. Now, every crime needs to, have its proportionate weight. Just because, you can sentence a person to, 18 months, 2-3 years in the state prison doesn't mean that you shouldn't use some discretion within that grouping of sentences. And what ends up happening is that we have devalued the crime to the point where there really isn't the incentive to go investigate it, prosecute it, and sentence. And if you don't have an accountability for the individual committing the crime, you're not going to change their behavior. And that's really what we're trying to do in the end. We're trying to change a person's behavior, either by providing them with the services that they need for their addiction or their mental issues, or giving them the accountability that this isn't worth my, 18 months sitting around a prison.
I attended a really impressive, inspiring court in Oakland many years ago, and it was I believe they called it a compassion court, where it took place not in a courthouse or a government building. It was in a community center, and they were able to come through and process all kinds of misdemeanors and really hear and listen to the person's rehabilitation journey. And I was really inspired by that because I saw the effect it had on the individual who is coming forward in that environment. And it didn't feel, it was punitive because it had to be, but it was also rehabilitative because there was a degree of care taken.
Right. And that is something that I think, to the credit of the California court system, that has been developed here and around the country. But we've spent a lot of time within the criminal justice system developing veterans courts to be compassionate towards veterans. We've built drug courts. We've got mental health courts. Number of other courts have come since I left the bench in 2017. The real issue there is not where they're being held, but there is an accountability for the person, but also a compassion for the person's success. And, just like a small child at school, you are, when they succeed, you praise them. When they don't succeed, you help teach them.
Yep.
And I think that's where those courts have become very, very effective, but they're not the end all, because some people just are not to the point. They're in the crime committing phase, and they're not in the I want to rehabilitate. So you've got to have both pieces. You've got to have the ability to provide a process within the criminal justice system to help somebody rehabilitate and get out of that.
And process and a dignity to it as well, because
Precisely.
a lot of, I think, and this is my own experience being around individuals who are in the rehabilitation process, is there's a sense that society has ripped away their agency, sovereignty, and dignity and opportunities. And this is where I have been most interested in lending support, is how do we create a system of real opportunity? And it really has to come from the top, right? It has to come from the mayor, the governor, the representatives of Congress in the area, who are not necessarily trying to whittle away at victims' rights, but who are invested in the economic opportunities and the dignity of the members of that society, of that community.
That's correct. But it also needs to flow up from the bottom. The individuals need to be receptive. Society as a whole needs to be receptive to allowing people to come back into society who've really wronged the populace as a whole, stealing from them, committing more serious crimes, violence. So you've got to be able to bring a person back into society. At the same time, you're holding that individual accountable for what they did.
What do you think about how COVID and California being a sanctuary state? Because I was looking at some of the data, and what I was realizing was that undocumented individuals, or individuals that came in without prior documents, they were starting to absorb a lot of community resources. And it was being perceived as taking away from those communities that were already struggling and trying to bring themselves up by their bootstraps. And so you have this influx of millions of individuals who are, many of which, working under the table.
Right.
In the community, taking up the lowest cost rents, absorbing the, community resources, medical resources as well, educational resources for the children, receiving direct aid from the government as well, aid that citizens in those communities were not receiving, and support they weren't receiving. So it's this sense of almost suffocating these communities with these terrible policies, from immigration to how COVID was handled, because many of these people are wage workers as well. When I was growing up, I was a wage worker, and had I lost my wage, yeah, I would have needed to steal. I would
Yeah.
have. I'll admit here, I stole a chicken from Safeway once because I was hungry.
Yeah.
I was really hungry. And I've never really admitted this publicly, but I was in middle school.
Fortunately, the statute's passed.
Okay, good. I'm 39. Yes, I think it has. All right. It was a rotisserie chicken at my local Safeway, and I put it in my little Jensen backpack because I was really hungry and I couldn't work yet because I was 11.
Yeah.
And when I was 12, I could work and I received a wage. But, there's so many young people who are desperate, who are hungry and are not receiving government aid. And if the law, says you can steal up to $900 of rotisserie chickens, I would have, right? This really begs the question, like, what is our role here when we think about really, and again, going back to what I said earlier, I really am invested in making sure that we have the right mechanisms for young people in need to have every opportunity to get where they need to get. So like when we were looking at COVID, were they looking at the fact that wage workers were going to be out of work for 2 years? That young kids, 15-year-olds who are legal to work. I mean, I worked under the table as a bus girl, but like, where's the consideration for that? And then where's the consideration for an immigration policy on the impact on these, sensitive communities?
It just doesn't seem like that people have thought through the policy of just wholesale allowing people to come into the country across the border. Because it really does send the message to those that are here that you're not important, that having people come across the border illegally is more important to us than your needs. So, yes, I think the communities have been severely impacted by, the reduction in services to people that are here. Crime has increased. I mean, there's no question that we have more crime being committed collectively, and I'm not going to apportion the crime out to illegals as opposed to people who were here before that are committing crimes. But the fact of the matter is, I think many of our citizens and those that are here documented are feeling that they've been abandoned by their government, whether it's on the federal level or the state level. It seems like all services are being redirected towards this new group of people that are essentially invading our country. And that's unfortunate, because we really have a duty to our citizens and those that we've allowed to enter legally to provide, a minimum of services, food, clothing, shelter, when they need it. We don't have an obligation to provide it for their entire life, but we do have an obligation as a fair society to protect people who have needs.
And who have followed the law.
Followed the law.
And who were born here, or their parents immigrated here and did the hard work of legal immigration. It is very hard to legally immigrate.
Absolutely.
I still remember my little Chinese grandma at the age of 70 who barely spoke English, and she had to pass her test, her citizenship test, and answer really hard questions about this country that she didn't really have the language for.
Sure.
But she did it. She studied, and we helped her study. But I remember how scared she was. She was shedding hair. She was so nervous. And she couldn't sleep the night before. And she worked so hard to do it and lived a very humble life here once she immigrated and took care of her grandkids, took care of me and my brother, and really contributed to her local community as well. And her kids did too. So that's the kind of commitment to this country that builds healthy communities and healthy next generations who respect this country and respect the people in this country as
Right.
well. What do you think about all of this stuff going on with activist DAs and this idea that George Soros is responsible for some of this? Because I wasn't aware of this George Soros's involvement. I had heard bits and pieces, but I was in my own little pocket of California looking at criminal justice reform. And initially I thought, yeah, it would be great to have DAs that are using their incredible discretion to bring balance and fairness and not over incarcerate. I think that's wonderful. But it becomes problematic if the DA is no longer being a DA and that they're working as a public defender. Talk to this balance here. What is the right balance a DA should take today? And when is it wrong for a DA to look at themselves more as a public defender?
In the perfect world, the district attorney is there to provide a fair stop where you have a prosecutor that looks at a case, looks at the facts, compares it to the law, and makes a fair charging decision, regardless of race, color, creed, sexual orientation, or anything. They completely put all that out of mind. But just like criminal justice, goes back like a pendulum on a clock, from liberal to conservative, what we've got kind of on this pendulum are prosecutors that are no longer really looking at it objectively, fairly, without consequence to any of the other factors that a person has, again, race, color, creed.
Yeah, it's about $150,000 to win a DA race in the country right now. Some of them are more than others. LA County, this one's is a high stake one, is millions of dollars, which is unusual. But it's become very political. It's become very much divided that it's hard to find a Democratic DA now in a blue state that is going to think about victims' rights and prioritize victims' rights.
And that's so unfortunate because, again, it's that balancing of the justice system. The DA is absolutely critical to that. If they take the position that we are not going to hold people accountable, then we don't have justice. The flip side is the DA that's going to prosecute everyone from for spitting on the sidewalk type of thing. And and try to put those people in prison. And what you end up with is something akin, in my opinion, to what the January 6th prosecutions are, where, rather everything has got to be a creative use of the federal criminal justice statutes. And when you get so creative that you're trying to put somebody in prison for basically trespassing on the Capitol grounds on January 6th, that is damaging the criminal justice system. It may sound like you're being tough on crime and you're putting people in prison and holding them accountable, but what you're really doing is sending a message to society and the public as a whole that we're going to prosecute those people because we don't like their politics. We're not going to prosecute these other people who are doing exactly the same thing the night before, protesting at the White House, and we're not going to prosecute them. They get off. And that's that'll damage, if not destroy, public confidence in our criminal
It
justice
has.
system.
It already has. And, the media has played a role in that as well. And it really makes people feel persecuted in this country for that reason. And we have these founding documents that says the punishment has to fit the crime,
That's it.
and that there's equal protection under the law.
Right. So it's just as bad to be, I'm going to throw the book at somebody for nothing, as it is to say, I'm not going to throw the book at a person for anything. And so you get the Gascons on one side who have reached the point of, we're just not going to prosecute crime, to, DAs on the other that are going to prosecute everything when it really doesn't really warrant it, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. And before we sat down and started recording, I shared with you my perspective that there's this shadow organization that has taken hold over our criminal justice system and has politicized it intentionally,
Yep.
because it is something that is so critical to a sense of fairness and safety.
Right.
And justice. I mean, it's the justice system. And if you have a organization that is using the justice system for political purposes and creating chaos in communities, it's probably the fastest way to destabilize our country.
Right.
There's no more efficient way to do so.
Right. When you talk about the rule of law,
Yeah.
people have to have confidence that the rule of law, that the law is going to be applied fairly to everyone, regardless. And that if you commit a crime, that you're going to be prosecuted for it. And if you're found guilty, that you're going to be punished appropriately for it. And what we've got when these pendulums swing, when it hits, that high point on either side, it's really telling the public, we've got a problem here. We've got to bring it back. And that's where we are today in California with Prop 36. We're beginning to bring it back. And it'll take a couple years for us to see how that cycle works, because just as we said with Prop 47, it wasn't, it passes in 2014, goes immediately into effect 15, 16, you don't really notice it from the statistics, but by 18, you're beginning to see it. And now we're here in 24, and we're beginning to move the pendulum back.
I personally believe that if we didn't have the pressures of COVID and mass migration to the state and to low-income communities, that would take so much pressure off the justice system as well. I think that those two items, the COVID wrecked our economies. It wrecked our small business economies in serious, serious ways. And then the migrant issue, which has been so distorted by our governor. I mean, Governor Newsom's done a disaster with how he's allocated resources for that and how he's ripped away funding from citizens.
Right.
And from our communities, our legal communities. If we fix those two things, I think we'd actually see a dramatic shift in our criminal justice system. I think we'd see a criminal justice system that would have the latitude and the freedom to finally find some homeostasis.
Right. Yeah, I think what COVID showed to the government was that it could centralize power and wouldn't have to give it up. The courts wouldn't intervene during COVID to really rein the government back in. So,
well, the courts couldn't even function during COVID.
Well,
barely function.
They didn't function.
They were on Zoom.
They didn't function well.
Yeah.
But they had the ability, even during COVID, to rein in the government. What the courts allowed to happen in COVID was when, by executive order, no legislative action, the president could essentially say, okay, we're going to close the country down 30 days, and in 30 days, we're going to have got ahead of this pandemic. Well, 30 days came and went. The government was no more in control of the pandemic than it was, 30 days earlier. But they were drunk on this power of being able to, control the populace. You had governors all over the country saying, wow, this is great. I can, by executive order, close all the businesses in California, or around the country for that matter. Worse yet, by executive order, I could say, your business, however, it's really important. So you get to stay open. Oh, Hollywood, you got to keep your production going. So you get to, stay open. And pretty soon we had this disparity.
Amazon got to fully function as well.
Precisely. Yeah. But you became important. For example, lawyers were important. During COVID, I could go wherever I wanted as a lawyer in California, no restriction. I had to wear a mask, which wasn't helping anybody, but I could get on an airplane that was virtually empty. I could get on the freeway in Los Angeles and make it from the airport to Norwalk, which normally would take you an hour during rush hour, in about 10 minutes. Frankly, as a lawyer, I thought this was great. I had everybody else locked up in the country, and I was privileged because I was one of those special people that got to function during COVID. The problem is, I wasn't any more special than anyone else here. And if you can keep your dispensary open, but you can close your church, that's wrong. That was wrong in the beginning and should never have been allowed to happen. And there shouldn't have been any there shouldn't have been a judge in this country that would say, oh, well, I'm going to let that happen. The courts should have intervened when we first began to ask them for help, and they would not do it. They wouldn't do it at any point during COVID. All they set up was a situation for the government to be able to do the same thing again and point back to COVID as the rationale for being able to do it. You, judge, didn't tell me to not do it before. You now can't tell me to stop now because, I have that power.
Yeah. It really did define the bounds of precedent during a pandemic, which is, and I think many of us look at it and we look at the cost of it all, like the true cost of it all versus the benefits. And by far, we paid a far greater cost.
We did. And the thing that was so damaging, because we've talked about how the criminal justice system has been damaged by the fact that we aren't prosecuting crimes and holding people accountable.
Yep.
We didn't hold the government accountable. And we let the government tell us stories about all the good things that they were going to do. We had, senior leaders in the health community in Washington and Atlanta saying, masks do nothing to help you. Oh, but now we're going to have you wear masks and you must wear them.
Yeah.
When they knew in the beginning that it wasn't going to help, and it was just for the image and for the sake of the government being able to tell you what to do. We told churches that you couldn't open. We told restaurants that you could open, but you could only have 25%. But then this week, we're going to let you have 50% capacity. And next week, we're going to close you down again and entirely. And we're destroying those businesses. And yet, a companion business right down the street that was one of the special businesses, as we just talked about, can be open.
GameStop could be open.
Yeah, they could be open. The dispensary could be open. But, the food caterer for a Hollywood production, they could operate and you could have people all over that. But the restaurant couldn't continue to operate. And
I mean, no wonder people's mental health collapsed.
Absolutely. But more than collapsed, their faith in government and its ability to be truthful was destroyed. And it's going to take a generation for government to restore that. Right now, if they came to you today and told you that you are now going to be locked up in your house, it would not, you probably would say, somebody else can do that, but I'm not going to do that.
So I have a question about the California Republican Assembly.
Okay.
How is it over there these days? How is it being Republican in California right now? It must be an interesting time because people are just so damn sick of how California is operating.
Yeah, I'm not in tune to what the Assembly and Senate members are thinking, other than anecdotally talking to them occasionally. Some of the members. It's always frustrating for them to be in the minority. Mm-hmm. You kind of get to the point where you wouldn't know how to govern in the majority if you were given that power.
Because it's just been so off the table.
Right. It's been 30 years since the Republicans have been meaningful in Sacramento.
Yeah.
So it is very frustrating. The legislature has become more progressive each cycle. I think part of that is due to the power of, some of the unions, not the trades necessarily, but the government unions, SEIU in particular, the teachers union. They funnel, tens of millions of dollars into legislative campaigns. And California is just a tough place to run in. I mean, we're here in the San Francisco Bay Area. You could probably get all the Republicans in San Mateo and put them into, phone booth, joke. But I mean, frankly, the registration's someplace below 20%, maybe closing in on 10% here in San Mateo County. In San Francisco County, it's been below 10%. Mm-hmm. So there's almost no Republicans left in a place like San Francisco. So, it's hard for a Republican to be meaningful in the state of California. I do think having a healthy two-party system is critically important because it provides a check on the group that's in power, but we've kind of gotten to the point where they're not much of a check even any longer. Until we get a little bit more balance, it's like anything else. I mean, if you have no balance, you're going to have the majority just running roughshod over.
There's no accountability.
No accountability.
None whatsoever. And they talk to each other up into these echo chambers where they focus on absolutely irrelevant issues. They don't have any structure for harmonizing or progressing the issues that citizens really care about because they don't need to.
Right.
They don't have to. It's not something that is going to win them or lose them any seats anywhere.
That's it.
There's no pressure.
Right.
So how does a young person living in the state of California who's an independent and thinking about politics more strategically, and who has found lots of support? I think there are many Californians that have left the Democratic Party, going more center left, not fully Republican yet, but centrist. Lots of centrists here.
Right.
How do they think about creating more leverage with their, leadership, local or state?
I think California's really ready to have someone who can speak from the center. But you've got to be realistic. In terms of speaking from the center, even though people are moving maybe away from the Democrat Party towards the Republican, some Republicans are also moving towards the center because they don't, neither
You
side.
strike me as a centrist. You don't strike me as a conservative.
Well, if you wanted me to, I could give you the MAGA.
The MAGA version.
Yeah, the MAGA version.
I actually find many MAGA individuals to be centrist.
Well, here's where my belief is. My belief is that I have to be able to be in a position to listen to you. I want to be able to listen to somebody that disagrees with me on nearly every issue. We will find some positions and issues that we agree on if we talk to one another. So I don't like to take any position and necessarily say, there's no way I could find common ground with you.
I think you and I, even the version of me that was pro criminal justice reform in 2016, you and I would immediately agree on investing in the quality of services.
Absolutely.
We would 100% agree on that. We would agree on that back then. We agree on that now. I think we'd agree on that in 5 years from now after Prop 36 is victorious. Quality of services and focusing on those individuals in the process of rehabilitation is something I believe all of us would agree on.
Right. And it's so critical because if you don't want to, kind of do the same thing over and over and over again in criminal justice, we better figure out a way to help divert people who want to be assisted away from the antisocial.
And accountability of those groups responsible for delivering those services.
That's right.
And that payment should be based on success.
It should be.
And increases in funding budgets should be based on success.
Right. And
directly tied to recidivism and crime rate.
Exactly. And there are some programs that we could go to today that are successful and have long-term proven records of success.
And if we put our minds together on that, we spent 100 hours on that. Just that one piece. Let's go to evidence-based success stories.
Exactly. And then let's replicate them.
Yeah.
Because there's what they're doing that's successful can be replicated someplace else.
And shut down the programs that are not working.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, to do that, however, requires impartiality. Because what ends up happening is, I like your program. It may not be very successful. Maybe it's just moderately successful, but I'm not going to take the action to shut you down. And I have a program that is, going gangbusters over here. I'm not even going to look at it because I don't have the funding to give to them. So impartiality, fairness is absolutely critical in it. And that generally requires a number of people looking at it from different directions and coming to a consensus on what's working. I think we all can agree that within our criminal justice system, mental health treatment is absolutely critical. That if we can't get people stabilized either through therapy or chemical treatment, we're not going to get them out of the system that is dragging them and society.
So a lot of it also does rely on good science.
It relies on good science.
What do you think of what President Bukele of El Salvador is doing?
Well, that's interesting. I was in Washington, D.C. back in April, and I had the opportunity to have a Uber driver who was from El Salvador give me a ride into town. And we got on the subject of, he was from El Salvador, and he was just a big supporter of the president. And frankly, I didn't know who the guy was at the time. But he's just telling me how he just loves, he loved Trump, but he really loved what his president in El Salvador was doing. And what he told me was he had family in El Salvador. He said, I couldn't go back home. It was too dangerous to go home. And now the crime rate's down. I can actually go home to see my family.
Yeah.
It was, regardless of what was being done exactly. Mm-hmm. And I've heard, issues on both sides that maybe they're...
He's talked about crime within the context of spirituality.
Yeah.
And I will say, I'm actually meeting with a bishop later today who's a chaplain at a prison in the East Bay.
Uh-huh.
And she has pretty clear blueprints on how spirituality and the criminal justice system go hand in hand.
It does. I believe that we need to have people open within the jails to be able to talk about their religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. And I believe that people that are strong in faith mm-hmm. are going to be more receptive to complying with our, general requirements for society and functioning in society. But the key to me on El Salvador was that what the president was doing, however he was doing it, was improving the lives of the individuals in the country.
Yeah.
And when your goal becomes that, obviously you can't have a system that wholesalely sends people off to prison mm-hmm. forever, but the gangs and the ones that had absolutely no compulsion against killing someone or mm-hmm. assaulting someone.
Or kidnapping.
They've got to be off the street. Mm-hmm. That's what 3 strikes did for California. But it wasn't the perfect solution, because what we ended up with was, somebody that goes in and steals a sandwich out of a convenience store getting 25 to life. And that never struck me as particularly fair.
No, and there's a difference between someone who steals a chicken from Safeway and somebody who's part of a gang and is, murdering people and selling huge amounts of drugs.
That's right.
That's where reasonableness really does need to play a role in every touch point
sense
of the criminal justice system. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me. It's been really nice to be able to talk through what has been over politicized and turned into, unfortunately, a bipartisan issue. It's not a bipartisan issue. It's an American issue. It's a civil society issue, but it's not an issue of Democrat versus Republican.
It certainly is not, and mm-hmm. it's not conservative versus liberal. No. It's our ability to be able to function as people and live a life that is safe and where we can raise our kids and our family.
Yeah, and it's doing the hard work of trying to figure out what reform looks like and bringing homeostasis to it.
That's true.
It's hard work. We're
is.
never going to get the opportunity to do it if we keep turning it into kind of this political lambasting of one another.
Yep, that's true.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.